The silence stretched like a held breath, thick and unnatural. Marcus stood frozen himself, not by whatever force had claimed the others, but by the impossibility of what he was witnessing. Mrs. Henderson remained suspended mid-gesture, her hand reaching toward the scattered papers, her eyes wide and unblinking. The three boys looked like a photograph snapped at the exact moment their laughter died, their faces still twisted in cruel amusement. Only the soft sound of Emma's breathing broke the supernatural quiet. "Dad?" Emma's voice was small, uncertain. She pushed back from her desk, her sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. "What's wrong with everyone?" Marcus forced himself to move, his boots heavy against the floor. Each step seemed to echo in the vacuum of silence. He knelt beside his daughter, his large hands gentle as they checked her for injuries. A small bruise bloomed purple on her forearm, and his jaw tightened. "I don't know, sweetheart." The words felt strange in his mouth, inadequate. In 8 years of single parenthood, he'd never lied to Emma about anything important. He wasn't about to start now, even if the truth was something he couldn't begin to understand. The frozen tableau around them felt like a fever dream. Mrs. Henderson's coffee mug hung tilted in mid-fall, the liquid suspended in a perfect brown arc. A pencil that one of the boys had dropped hovered 6 inches above the floor, defying gravity and reason. Marcus's military training kicked in. Assess, analyze, act. But no amount of special forces experience had prepared him for this. He'd seen men die in ways that haunted his dreams, had walked through villages where time seemed to have stopped in more conventional ways. This was something else entirely. "Can we help them?" Emma whispered, her small hand slipping into his calloused palm. Marcus studied the frozen figures, noting the terror etched in Mrs. Henderson's features. The way even the bullies' expressions had shifted from amusement to something approaching fear in that final instant. Whatever this was, they were aware of it, trapped inside their own bodies while time moved around them. "I think we should go," he said quietly, lifting Emma's torn backpack. The sight of her destroyed homework, carefully completed the night before at their kitchen table, sent another wave of anger through him. But even that emotion felt dangerous now, like a match struck too close to gasoline. They moved toward the door together, Emma's hand still clutched in his. As they reached the threshold, Marcus turned back for one last look at the impossible scene. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows painted everything in shades of gold and amber, making the frozen classroom look almost peaceful. Almost. Then he stepped back into the hallway, and the world snapped back to life. The crash of Mrs. Henderson's coffee mug hitting the floor echoed down the corridor. Shouts of confusion and fear erupted from room 14B, followed by the teacher's sharp voice demanding to know what had happened. Marcus didn't wait to find out. He swept Emma up in his arms and strode toward the exit, his long legs covering ground with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Brennan," Mrs. Henderson's voice called after them. "Mr. Brennan, please wait." But Marcus had spent too many years surviving by trusting his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to get Emma away from here, away from whatever he'd somehow triggered, away from the questions he couldn't answer and the attention he couldn't afford. The late October air hit them like a slap as they burst through the school's front doors. Marcus's Harley waited in the visitor parking lot, chrome gleaming despite its age. He set Emma down gently, then pulled her helmet from the saddlebag, bright yellow with flower stickers she'd applied herself during their first week in Cedar Falls. "Are we in trouble?" Emma asked, as she slipped the helmet over her small head. Marcus fastened the chin strap, his fingers steady despite the chaos in his mind. "No, baby girl, we're not in trouble. Not yet, anyway." But trouble was coming. He could feel it in the way his skin prickled, in the familiar weight that settled between his shoulder blades. It was the same sensation he'd carried through mountain villages in Afghanistan, through the corridors of military facilities where men in expensive suits had promised him that the experiments would make him a better soldier. They'd never mentioned making him into something that could stop time itself. The Harley roared to life beneath them, a sound that usually brought Marcus peace. Today it felt like a warning bell, announcing their departure to anyone who might be watching. Emma wrapped her small arms around his waist, trusting him completely as they pulled out of the school parking lot. In his rearview mirror, Marcus caught a glimpse of Mrs. Henderson standing in the school's entrance, her hand shading her eyes as she watched them disappear. Even from this distance, he could see the confusion written across her features. She wouldn't be the only one with questions, and Marcus had a sinking feeling that the answers would destroy the quiet life he'd built for them both. The wind whipped past them as they rode through Cedar Falls, Emma's small form pressed against his back like an anchor to normalcy. Marcus took the long route home, needing the extra minutes to think, to process what had happened in that classroom. The familiar streets blurred past, Maple Avenue with its century-old oak trees, the corner market where old Pete always waved from behind the register, the fire station where volunteers gathered every Friday night to play poker and complain about their wives. This was their world, safe, predictable, ordinary. Everything Marcus had fought to build after fleeing the shadows of his past. Their house sat at the end of Birch Street, a modest two-bedroom craftsman with blue shutters and a front porch Emma had convinced him to line with flower boxes. The mortgage was under the name David Mitchell, one of several identities Marcus had cultivated over the years, but the home itself was real. Every nail he'd hammered, every wall he'd painted, every creaky board he'd meant to fix but somehow never got around to. He parked the Harley in the detached garage next to Emma's purple bicycle and the workbench where he restored vintage motorcycle parts in the evenings. The familiar smell of motor oil and sawdust usually calmed him. Today it felt like evidence of a life that might already be slipping away. "Dad, can we have grilled cheese for lunch?" Emma asked, hanging her helmet on its designated hook. Her voice carried forced brightness, the way it always did when she was trying to pretend everything was normal. "Of course, sweetheart." Marcus studied her face as they walked toward the house. The bruise on her arm had darkened, and he noticed now that her left knee was scraped beneath her torn tights. "How long has this been going on, Em?" "The bullying?" She shrugged, suddenly fascinated by her shoes. "It's not that bad, Emma." His voice carried the gentle authority that could coax truth from her when nothing else worked. "How long?" "Since school started. The admission came out in a rush, but I thought I could handle it. You always say I'm brave like Mom was." The words hit him like a physical blow. Sarah had been brave, too brave, according to the military investigators who dismissed her death as an unfortunate accident during a routine convoy escort in Iraq. Marcus knew better. Sarah had been asking questions about the experimental program, about what they were doing to her husband during those classified sessions. Questions that had apparently made the wrong people nervous. Now their daughter was trying to be brave too, fighting battles she shouldn't have to fight while Marcus remained oblivious, lost in his own careful routines. Inside, their kitchen welcomed them with honey-colored walls and the herb garden Emma tended on the windowsill. Marcus moved through the familiar motions of lunch preparation while Emma sat at the table swinging her legs and pretending to work on math homework. The normalcy felt fragile, like walking on ice that might crack at any moment. His phone buzzed. A text from Tom Rodriguez at the garage. Kid called in sick. "Can you cover the afternoon shift?" Marcus stared at the message, thumb hovering over the reply. Brennan's Auto and Cycle was more than just his cover identity. It had become real over the past 8 years. Tom had hired him when no one else would risk employing a drifter with gaps in his employment history. The customers trusted him with their bikes, their cars, sometimes their stories about marriages falling apart or kids who wouldn't call home. It was honest work, satisfying in ways his military service had never been. But everything felt different now. The questions Mrs. Henderson would ask, the way people would look at him once word spread about the incident at school. Cedar Falls was too small for secrets, too tight-knit for mysteries to survive long. "Dad?" Emma's voice pulled him back to the present. "Your phone's buzzing again." 3 more messages had appeared. Tom, Mrs. Henderson, an unknown number that made his blood run cold. Only 2 people had ever contacted him from blocked numbers, and one of them was supposed to be dead. Emma was watching him with Sarah's eyes. The same shade of green, the same intelligence that missed nothing. At 10, she was already too perceptive for her own good. She'd inherited her mother's gift for reading people, for seeing through the masks adults wore. "Everything's fine," Marcus lied, sliding the phone into his pocket. The unknown number could wait. Everything could wait, except the grilled cheese growing golden in the pan, and the little girl who trusted him to keep her world intact. But as he flipped the sandwich, Marcus caught his reflection in the kitchen window. For just a moment, he looked like a stranger, someone dangerous enough to make an entire classroom freeze in terror, someone the government had spent months turning into a weapon before setting him loose in the world. The quiet life he'd built was crumbling, and he had no idea how to stop it. The grilled cheese was still warm on the plate when Marcus finally opened the message from the unknown number. "We know what happened at the school. Time to come home, ghost." The phone slipped from his fingers, clattering against the kitchen floor. Emma looked up from her sandwich, a question forming on her lips, but Marcus was already moving. 8 years of careful paranoia kicked in like muscle memory. Escape routes, emergency protocols, the go bag hidden in the bedroom closet. "Dad?" Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. Marcus forced himself to stop, to breathe. His reflection in the toaster showed wild eyes, the same expression he'd worn in those final weeks at Fort Detrick when the experiments had started producing results no one had expected, when Dr. Reeves had looked at him like he was no longer entirely human. "Sorry, sweetheart, dropped my phone." He retrieved it, noting how his hands remained steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. The message was still there, real as the bruise on Emma's arm. Only 3 people had ever called him Ghost. 2 of them were dead. The third had promised him that their arrangement was permanent, that David Mitchell could live quietly in Cedar Falls forever as long as Marcus Brennan stayed buried. Colonel James Voss had lied before. Emma was studying him with that unsettling perception she'd inherited from Sarah. "Is someone coming to visit us?" The innocent question hit him like shrapnel. Someone was definitely coming, but they wouldn't be bringing flowers and small talk. They'd be bringing questions about classified programs and impossible abilities. Questions that would tear apart the only good thing Marcus had managed to build from the wreckage of his life. "Maybe," he said carefully. "Would that bother you?" She considered this, taking another bite of grilled cheese. "Depends. Are they nice people?" Marcus almost laughed. Nice wasn't a word that applied to anyone from his past. Necessary, maybe. Useful, certainly. But nice? The men who'd turned him into whatever he'd become had filed off that particular edge years ago. His phone buzzed again. Tom, wondering about the afternoon shift. Then, "Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Brennan, we need to discuss what happened today. Please call me." The walls of their kitchen suddenly felt too close, too fragile, like a house of cards that someone was preparing to blow down. How would you feel about taking a little trip?" The words came out before he'd fully formed the thought, but they felt right. Movement was safety. Movement was survival. "Like camping?" Her face brightened. They'd spent last summer exploring the Oregon coast, just the 2 of them, and a tent under stars that reminded Marcus of nights in Afghanistan when the world had made more sense. Something like that. Marcus was already calculating distances, safe houses, people who might help without asking too many questions. Old habits from a life he'd tried to leave behind. "We could visit that beach where we saw the whales." But even as he spoke, Marcus knew running wouldn't solve anything. Whatever had happened in that classroom wasn't going away. The ability, if that's what it was, lived inside him now, waiting. And the people who'd created it weren't the type to simply let their investment disappear into the Oregon wilderness. Emma finished her sandwich, swinging her legs contentedly. She trusted him completely, the way children trust parents to keep the monsters at bay. She had no idea that the monster might be sitting across from her, struggling to look normal while his entire world tilted sideways. The afternoon light streaming through their kitchen window painted everything in shades of gold and amber, the same light that had frozen Mrs. Henderson's classroom in that impossible moment. Marcus stared at his hands, searching for some sign of what he'd become. They looked ordinary enough, calloused from honest work, scarred from years of handling tools and engines, human hands. But he remembered the feeling in that classroom, the way the air had changed when his anger peaked, the sensation of something vast and terrible stirring awake inside him, responding to his need to protect Emma. His phone buzzed one final time. The unknown number again. You have 48 hours to make contact. After that, we come to you. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Marcus deleted the message, but the threat lingered like smoke in the air. 48 hours to decide whether to run or fight. Whether to keep pretending he was just David Mitchell, small-town mechanic and devoted father, or accept that Marcus Ghost Brennan was alive and dangerous, and exactly what his daughter needed him to be. Emma was watching him again, those green eyes missing nothing. Dad, are the nice people coming or the other kind? The question hung between them like a bridge Marcus would have to cross one way or another. On the other side waited either salvation or destruction. He just wasn't sure which was which anymore. Marcus stared at Emma's question, the weight of it settling in his chest like lead. The nice people or the other kind? If only it were that simple. I don't know yet, baby girl. The honesty felt like swallowing glass. But we'll figure it out together, okay? Emma nodded, seemingly satisfied. But Marcus could see the worry lines forming around her eyes. Too mature for a 10-year-old. Too familiar with uncertainty. He'd spent 8 years trying to give her the childhood he'd never had, the stability Sarah had dreamed of for their family. Now that foundation was cracking beneath his feet. After Emma settled into the living room with her sketch pad, Marcus retreated to their small bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. The man in the mirror looked haunted, hollow-eyed, the same expression he'd worn during those final weeks at Fort Detrick when sleep had become impossible and Dr. Reeves had started asking increasingly uncomfortable questions about his episodes. The neural pathways are adapting faster than we anticipated, she'd said, stylus clicking against her tablet. We're seeing unprecedented synchronization between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. Tell me again about the sensation you experienced during yesterday's stress test. Marcus had tried to explain the feeling, like standing at the edge of a vast ocean that responded to his emotions, that surged and receded with his heartbeat. But words had been inadequate then, just as they were inadequate now to describe what had happened in Emma's classroom. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping at a name he hadn't called in 3 years. Jake Sullivan, former Delta Force, current private security contractor with connections throughout the shadow world Marcus had once inhabited. If anyone could tell him whether Colonel Voss was still pulling strings from his Pentagon office, it would be Jake. But calling Jake meant admitting that David Mitchell was a fiction. It meant dragging another person into the crossfire that was coming whether Marcus wanted it or not. And Jake had a family too, twin daughters Emma's age, a wife who taught Sunday school and believed her husband consulted on corporate security. Marcus set the phone aside. Some bridges were better left unburned until there was no other choice. From the living room came the soft scratch of Emma's colored pencils against paper. She was drawing again, the way she always did when anxiety crept in. Last month it had been horses. The month before, elaborate castles with impossible towers. Today would probably be something darker. Storm clouds, maybe, or the empty faces she'd been sketching since the bullying started. The bullying. Christ, what kind of father was he? 3 weeks of his daughter coming home with torn clothes and bruised feelings, and he'd been oblivious, lost in his own careful routines. Too focused on maintaining their cover to notice that Emma was fighting a war of her own. You always say I'm brave like Mom was. Sarah's bravery had gotten her killed. The thought arrived unbidden, sharp as a blade. She'd kept pushing, kept asking questions about the program, about what they were doing to her husband during those classified sessions. Questions that had made Colonel Voss nervous enough to arrange an accident during a routine convoy escort in Iraq. Would Emma inherit that same dangerous curiosity? Would she grow up asking the wrong questions, pushing against forces that pushed back with lethal precision? Marcus gripped the sink until his knuckles went white. Every instinct screamed at him to pack their bags and disappear into the network of safe houses and false identities he'd maintained for exactly this scenario. They could be in Canada by nightfall, lost in a country where David Mitchell had never existed, and Marcus Ghost Brennan was just another American expatriate running from divorce debt or tax problems. But running meant Emma would never have a real home again. No friends, No stable school, no chance to be a normal kid who worried about math tests and playground politics instead of surveillance protocols and emergency exits. It meant raising her the way he'd been raised, always moving, always looking over their shoulders, always ready to abandon everything at a moment's notice. It meant making her into what he'd become. "Dad?" Emma's voice drifted from the living room. "Can you look at my picture?" Marcus dried his face and walked to where she sat cross-legged on their worn sofa. The sketch pad showed a detailed drawing of their house. Blue shutters, flower boxes, even the crooked mailbox he'd been meaning to fix. But storm clouds gathered overhead, and in the yard stood two figures, a small girl with green eyes and a tall man whose face was hidden in shadow. "It's us," Emma said quietly. "But I couldn't remember how to draw your face." The words hit him harder than any classified message or veiled threat. In trying to protect her from his past, he'd hidden so much of himself that his own daughter couldn't capture his features on paper. She saw David Mitchell, the careful mask he wore for the world, not the father who read her bedtime stories or the man who still kept Sarah's picture on his nightstand. Certainly not the weapon the government had forged in laboratories and stress tests. 46 hours remaining until they came for him. 46 hours to decide whether to run or fight, whether to keep lying or finally tell Emma the truth about who her father really was. Neither choice felt like one he could live with. Marcus sat beside Emma on the sofa, studying the drawing where his face disappeared into shadow. The metaphor was too perfect, too painful. For 8 years, he'd been a ghost haunting his own life, and now his daughter's pencils had captured that truth with devastating accuracy. "It's beautiful, Em." He traced the edge of the paper with one finger, careful not to smudge her work. Sometimes faces are hard to draw when there's too much to remember about them. She leaned against his shoulder, solid and warm and real. "Mom's face is getting harder to remember too." "Is that bad?" The question gutted him. Sarah had been gone for 8 years, longer than Emma had truly known her. Of course, the memories were fading, replaced by photographs and stories that grew more distant with each telling. Marcus had tried to keep Sarah alive in their daily conversations, but how do you preserve a ghost without becoming one yourself? "No, sweetheart, it's not bad. It's just what happens." He pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "But the important things don't fade. The way she made you laugh, how safe you felt when she sang you to sleep, that stays forever." Emma nodded against his chest, and Marcus felt something shift inside him. A decision crystallizing like ice forming on a window. He'd spent 8 years protecting Emma from his past, but his past had found them anyway. The men who'd created Ghost weren't going to disappear because David Mitchell wished hard enough. They wanted their weapon back, and they'd use Emma as leverage if necessary. The realization cut through his paralysis like a blade. He couldn't run, not anymore. Running meant constantly looking over their shoulders, meant Emma never having a real home or lasting friendships. It meant living in the shadows until she grew up twisted by secrets and paranoia, just like her father. But staying meant facing whatever he'd become in that classroom. It meant accepting that Marcus Ghost Brennan was real, that the experiments had worked, and that the government's investment in him came with a price he'd been foolish to think he could avoid forever. "Em, I need to tell you something important." The words felt like stepping off a cliff. "About who I really am, about who we really are." She pulled back to look at him, those green eyes so much like Sarah's that it hurt. "Are you not really my dad?" "I'm absolutely your dad. That's the one thing that's completely true." Marcus cupped her face in his hands, memorizing every detail. "But my name isn't really David Mitchell, and some people are going to come looking for me soon. People from before you were born, from when I was a soldier." Emma's expression grew serious, the way it did when she was processing something complicated. "Are they the bad people? The ones who hurt Mom?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He'd never told Emma the truth about Sarah's death, had let her believe the official story about an accident, a roadside bomb that claimed her mother and 3 other soldiers during a routine escort mission. But Emma was too smart, too perceptive. Of course she'd sensed there was more to the story. "Yes," he said simply. "They're the bad people. So we're going to fight them." It wasn't a question. Emma's voice carried the same quiet determination Sarah had shown when she'd decided to dig into the classified program, the same dangerous bravery that had gotten her mother killed. Marcus felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble. For 8 years he'd been David Mitchell, mild-mannered mechanic, devoted single father, pillar of the Cedar Falls community. But David Mitchell couldn't protect Emma from what was coming. Only Ghost could do that. "We're going to fight them," he agreed, and felt something vast and terrible stir awake inside his chest. The same sensation he'd experienced in the classroom, but stronger now. Purposeful. "But first, I need to make some phone calls and pack some bags. Are we going on our camping trip?" Something like that. Marcus stood, decision made. No more running, no more hiding. If Colonel Voss wanted Ghost back, he'd get his weapon, just not the way he expected. "Emma, do you remember the rules we practiced about what to do if strangers come to the house?" She nodded solemnly. "Hide in the basement closet. Don't come out until you or Mrs. Chen use the special word." "Good girl." He kissed the top of her head, then walked to their kitchen junk drawer and pulled out a key he'd hoped never to use. It opened a safety deposit box in Portland that contained everything they'd need for what came next: documents, cash, and weapons that David Mitchell had no business owning. Marcus "Ghost" Brennan, however, had every right to arm himself against the people who'd stolen his life, murdered his wife, and now threatened his daughter. The comfortable fiction of their small-town existence was over. It was time to remind Colonel Voss why they'd called him Ghost in the first place, and why some weapons were too dangerous to ever fully control. Chapter 6, Tests and Allies. The drive to Portland took 3 hours, but Marcus made it in 2.5, pushing his old Chevy pickup harder than he had in years. Emma dozed in the passenger seat, her sketch pad clutched against her chest like armor. Every mile that passed felt like shedding skin, David Mitchell's careful restraint peeling away to reveal something harder underneath. The First National Branch on Morrison Street looked ordinary enough, all glass and marble designed to project stability and trust. Marcus had chosen it specifically for those qualities 8 years ago, when he'd needed somewhere to bury the tools of his former life. The safety deposit box was registered to a shell company that existed only on paper, funded by accounts that traced back to dead men and closed operations. "Stay close," he murmured to Emma as they walked through the lobby. His eyes swept the space automatically, cataloging exits and potential threats, old habits, dormant but not dead. "And remember what I told you about keeping quiet." The box contained exactly what he'd left there: 50,000 in untraceable cash, 3 sets of identification documents, and a Sig Sauer P226 with 4 loaded magazines. The weight of the weapon in his hands triggered something primal, muscle memory from a time when violence had been his profession rather than his curse. Emma watched him check the pistol's action with clinical efficiency. "Is that for the bad people?" "If necessary." Marcus slipped the gun into the shoulder holster he'd retrieved from the same box. The leather felt foreign against his ribs after years of wearing nothing more dangerous than work shirts and good intentions. But sometimes, just having it is enough to make people listen. They stopped at a sporting goods store on the way out of the city. Marcus bought camping gear that could double as survival equipment: water purification tablets, emergency rations, sleeping bags rated for sub-freezing temperatures. Emma picked out a new backpack, bright red with reflective strips. She seemed to understand this wasn't really about camping, but she played along with the fiction anyway. The drive back to Cedar Falls passed in comfortable silence until Marcus's phone rang. Jake Sullivan's name appeared on the caller ID, and Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He'd sent a single text from Portland: "Need to know if the colonel is still active. Urgent, Ghost." Jake's voice carried across 8 years like it had been 8 minutes. "Thought you were dead, brother." "Close enough. What do you know about Voss?" "Same as always. Too smart, too connected, and too fucking dangerous to ignore." Jake's tone shifted, growing cautious. "Word is, he's been asking questions about old projects lately, specifically about test subjects who went off the grid. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Marcus glanced at Emma, who was pretending to read while obviously listening to every word. Maybe. What kind of questions? The kind that end with black SUVs and midnight visits. Marcus, whatever you did to disappear, it's not working anymore. Voss has resources now. Private military contractors, unlimited black budget funding. If he wants you back, he's going to get you back. The highway stretched ahead like a tunnel, shadows lengthening as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Marcus had known this call was coming for 8 years, but the reality still felt like ice water in his veins. There might be another option, Jake continued. I've got contacts in the resistance movement, former operators who went private, people who know what bastards like Voss are capable of. They've been building a network, helping people like us disappear for real. What's the price? Information, files, witness testimony, anything that can expose the programs. They want to bring the whole thing down, Marcus. Make sure what happened to us never happens to anyone else. Marcus thought about Dr. Reeves and her endless tests, about the months of conditioning and chemical treatments that had turned him into something that could freeze an entire classroom with a glance, about Sarah's questions and the convoy that had killed her before she could find answers. I'll call you back, he said finally. Don't take too long, Ghost. Word is Voss moves tomorrow night. The line went dead, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of impossible choices. Fight or flight. Trust Jake's mysterious allies or handle this alone. Expose the truth about the program or take his secrets to the grave. Beside him, Emma stirred as they passed the Cedar Falls city limits sign. Dad, are we really going camping? Marcus looked at their house as it came into view. Blue shutters, flower boxes, the crooked mailbox that symbolized 8 years of normal life. A black sedan sat parked across the street, its occupants hidden behind tinted glass. Change of plans, sweetheart. He drove past their street without slowing, already plotting alternate routes to the highway. Looks like the camping trip starts tonight. Emma twisted in her seat to stare at the sedan. Those are the bad people, aren't they? Yeah. Marcus felt something cold and vast stirring in his chest, the same sensation from the classroom but sharper now, more focused. But they're about to learn why that's a mistake. The war had finally come to Cedar Falls. Chapter 7, The Approach. Marcus drove in silence for 10 minutes, watching the black sedan maintain its distance in his rearview mirror. Professional surveillance. Close enough to track, far enough back to avoid detection by anyone less experienced than a former Special Forces operative. They weren't trying to hide anymore, which meant the approach phase was over. Whatever Colonel Voss had planned was moving into active implementation. Dad, you're driving scary. Emma's voice cut through his tactical assessment. Her small hands gripped the door handle, knuckles white against the plastic. Marcus forced himself to ease off the accelerator, to breathe deeper and project calm he didn't feel. The last thing Emma needed was to see him lose control before the real danger even started. Sorry, sweetheart. Just thinking. About the bad people? About keeping you safe. He took the next right turn, testing whether their tail would follow. The sedan appeared 15 seconds later, making the same turn with mechanical precision. Emma, I need you to listen very carefully. In a few minutes, we're going to stop somewhere safe, and I'm going to make some phone calls. While I do that, you're going to practice being invisible. She nodded solemnly. They'd played the invisible game dozens of times over the years. Marcus had disguised it as fun, but it was pure survival training. Stay quiet, stay low, watch for threats, respond only to the correct code words. He'd hoped she'd never need those skills for real. The Cedar Falls Public Library sat on a hill overlooking the town, surrounded by enough trees to provide cover and multiple exit routes. More importantly, it had thick stone walls and a children's section in the basement, good protection and concealment if things went sideways. Marcus parked behind the building, noting how the black sedan continued past without slowing. They'd established a perimeter now, probably calling in additional units. Game time, Marcus said, shouldering the tactical bag he'd packed in Portland. Remember the rules. Don't talk to strangers. Stay where you can see the exits. If shooting starts, Get small and stay small until you come get me. Emma recited the instructions like a prayer, her young face far too serious for 10 years old. Marcus felt something break apart in his chest. No child should have to memorize those words, should have to understand the difference between regular strangers and the kind who killed mothers and disappeared fathers. But Emma was his daughter, which meant she'd inherited both Sarah's curiosity and his capacity for survival. Better to give her the tools she might need than pretend the world was safer than it was. The library's interior smelled like old books and floor wax, comfortingly normal after the tension of the drive. Marcus found Emma a corner table in the children's section where she could see anyone approaching while remaining hidden behind the stacks. She pulled out her sketch pad and colored pencils, settling into the routine of looking busy while staying alert. 15 minutes, Marcus told her. Then we move again. He climbed to the main floor and found a phone booth near the reference desk, one of the last remaining relics in a town that had resisted full modernization. His cell phone felt too exposed for what came next, too easy to trace, too vulnerable to the kind of surveillance technology Voss had access to. Jake answered on the first ring. Tell me you're somewhere safe. Define safe. Marcus watched the parking lot through the library's tall windows. No sign of the sedan, but that didn't mean anything. They'd be setting up overwatch positions now, waiting for him to make a mistake. How fast can your resistance friends move? Depends on what you're offering. You still have access to your project files? Marcus closed his eyes, remembering the manila folder he'd stolen the night before Sarah's convoy mission. Personnel records, experimental protocols, financial documentation, everything Dr. Reeves had compiled about Project Lazarus and its 17 test subjects. He'd hidden it in a place even paranoid government agents would never think to look. I have enough to bury Voss and everyone who worked with him, Marcus said. But I need guarantees. My daughter doesn't become collateral damage. Understood. There's an extraction team 2 hours out from your position. Can you stay mobile that long? Maybe. Marcus spotted movement in the parking lot. 2 men in dark suits walking the perimeter with practiced efficiency. Not local law enforcement. Federal contractors, probably former military themselves. Voss wasn't taking chances this time. Jake, I need to know something. The abilities they gave us, have you experienced any evolution? Silence stretched across the connection. When Jake finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. What kind of evolution? The kind that makes other people stop breathing when you're angry enough. Another pause. Jesus, Marcus, how many? Nobody died. They just froze, like statues. Marcus watched one of the suited men speak into a radio, coordinating with an unseen command structure. It happened at Emma's school, lasted maybe 30 seconds, then everyone snapped back to normal. That's new, Jake said grimly. None of the other survivors reported anything like that. Whatever they did to you, you got a different package than the rest of us. Marcus felt ice crystallizing in his stomach. 17 test subjects, and he was the only one developing new capabilities? That made him either invaluable or impossibly dangerous. Knowing Voss, probably both. The extraction team will have a psychologist with them, Jake continued. Someone who specializes in enhanced operators. You're not alone in this anymore, Ghost. 2 hours, Marcus repeated, committing to a timeline that felt both too long and impossibly short. Tell them to come ready for a fight. He hung up and returned to the children's section, where Emma had filled another page with detailed sketches. This time, she'd drawn the library, complete with emergency exits and sight lines. Her tactical instincts were developing faster than her father's had at twice her age. Time to go, Marcus said softly. Next stop is somewhere they won't think to look for us. Emma packed her supplies with efficient movements, slinging the red backpack over her shoulders. Are the good people coming to help? Yeah, sweetheart. The good people are coming. Marcus checked his weapon one more time, feeling the weight of approaching violence like a storm front moving in from the horizon. But first, we're going to visit an old friend. Mrs. Chen had been Sarah's mentor at the elementary school, and she'd helped Marcus navigate single parenthood in those early chaotic months after the funeral. More importantly, She lived in a converted farmhouse 3 miles outside town, isolated enough to avoid civilian casualties, defensible enough to make Voss's people work for their prize. Marcus took Emma's hand as they walked toward the library's back exit. Somewhere, in the darkness outside, trained killers were closing their net, confident that David Mitchell would surrender quietly to protect his daughter. They were about to discover their mistake. Ghost was done hiding. Now it was time to hunt. Chapter 8. The ordeal begins. The library's back exit opened onto a service alley lined with dumpsters and delivery trucks. Marcus pressed himself against the brick wall, Emma's small hand tight in his, as he scanned the shadows for movement. The autumn air carried the scent of rotting leaves and approaching rain, but underneath it all lurked something else, the metallic taste of adrenaline and impending violence. "Clear," he whispered. But the word felt like a lie even as he spoke it. They moved through the alley in a tactical crouch, Marcus's body automatically shifting into patterns drilled into him 15 years ago, in a dozen different hellholes. Emma matched his movements with disturbing precision, her 10-year-old frame adapting to combat spacing like she'd been born to it. The realization sent ice through Marcus's veins. His daughter was becoming what he'd tried so desperately to prevent. The pickup truck sat where he'd left it, but something felt wrong. Too quiet, too empty. Marcus's enhanced senses, sharpened by whatever Dr. Reeves had done to his nervous system, screamed warnings he couldn't quite articulate. The air itself felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. "Wait here," he told Emma, positioning her behind a concrete barrier. "Count to 60, then follow." But as Marcus approached the truck, the world exploded into chaos. Muzzle flashes erupted from 3 directions simultaneously. The rooftop across the street, a panel van parked 50 yards away, and the shadows between 2 buildings. Professional crossfire, designed to pin down and eliminate. Marcus threw himself sideways as bullets sparked off concrete and shattered the truck's rear window. "Contact! Contact!" The shouts came from trained voices, coordinated and calm. Not local police, federal contractors, just as he'd suspected. Marcus rolled behind his truck's engine block, drawing the Sig Sauer in one fluid motion. His mind automatically calculated angles and distances, while his body remained perfectly steady despite the gunfire. Whatever the military program had done to him, it had left him functionally immune to combat stress. He felt detached, analytical, like he was watching someone else's firefight. "David Mitchell," a voice boomed across the alley, amplified by a bullhorn. "This is Agent Harrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're surrounded. Release the child and surrender." Marcus almost laughed at the bureaucratic fiction. Voss was using official channels now, wrapping his black operations in legitimate authority. Clever. It meant local law enforcement wouldn't interfere, and any witnesses would remember federal agents conducting a lawful arrest, rather than private military contractors executing a kidnapping. "Emma, stay down," Marcus called over the gunfire, but when he glanced toward the concrete barrier, his heart stopped. She was gone. Panic slammed into him like a physical blow, shattering his combat calm for the first time in 15 years. Marcus's vision tunneled, his breathing accelerated, and somewhere deep in his chest, something vast and terrible began to stir. The same sensation from the classroom, but magnified beyond anything he'd experienced before. "Emma!" The word came out as a roar that seemed to echo off the alley walls with unnatural resonance. The gunfire stopped. Marcus looked up from his cover and felt reality tilt sideways. Every shooter, every federal agent, every moving thing in his line of sight had frozen mid-motion. A man rappelling down the building wall hung motionless in his harness. Another agent caught in the act of reloading stood like a statue, his hands locked around a fresh magazine. Even the pigeons that had been startled into flight remained suspended in the air, wings spread but utterly still. The silence was absolute. No breathing, no heartbeats, no sound except the whisper of wind through empty streets. Marcus rose from behind the truck, his weapon forgotten, staring at a tableau of human sculptures arranged in perfect, terrible stillness. "Dad?" Emma's voice came from behind him, small and frightened. Marcus spun around to find her emerging from a storm drain, her red backpack muddy but her eyes bright with excitement rather than fear. She'd followed escape protocols perfectly, disappearing into infrastructure most adults wouldn't even notice. "Are they dead?" she asked, studying the frozen agents with scientific curiosity. Marcus checked the nearest man's pulse. Strong and steady, but the agent's eyes stared sightlessly ahead, pupils fixed and dilated. Breathing so shallow it was barely detectable. "No. They're..." paused. "How long?" That was the question, wasn't it? Marcus had no idea how long the effect would last, or what would happen when it wore off. Would they remember? Would they even survive whatever he'd done to their nervous systems? "We need to move. Now." Marcus grabbed Emma's hand, leading her toward the street where civilian vehicles offered better cover than his compromised truck. "Whatever's happening to me, it's getting stronger. Is that bad?" Marcus looked back at the frozen tableau. 17 trained operators suspended like insects in amber, victims of a power he didn't understand and couldn't control. The ordeal had begun in earnest now. Everything he'd learned about hiding, about suppressing the monster the military had created, was being tested against stakes that couldn't be higher. His daughter's life hung in the balance, and he was becoming something that might be more dangerous than the people hunting them. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he was truly afraid. The stolen Honda Civic coughed to life as Marcus hot-wired the ignition, his hands moving with muscle memory while his mind raced through rapidly diminishing options. Emma sat in the passenger seat, still clutching her muddy backpack, her young face pale but resolute in the dashboard light. Behind them, the frozen tableau of federal agents remained motionless in the alley. 17 statues marking the moment Marcus's life had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "Mrs. Chen's house is 12 minutes from here," Marcus said, pulling onto the empty street. "Jake's extraction team won't reach us for another hour and 40 minutes. We just need to..." His phone rang. Unknown number. Marcus hesitated, then answered with the speakerphone. A cultured voice filled the car, calm and satisfied. "Hello, Marcus. Or should I say Ghost? This is Colonel Voss." Emma's eyes widened, but she remained silent. Smart girl. Always listening, always learning. "You son of a bitch," Marcus growled, accelerating through a yellow light. "If you hurt one hair on..." "Please, let's maintain some civility." Voss's tone carried the same patronizing warmth Marcus remembered from their sessions 15 years ago. "I'm calling to congratulate you, actually. Project Lazarus exceeded our wildest projections. 17 trained operators neutralized without firing a shot? Remarkable. What do you want?" "The same thing I've always wanted. To understand what we created. To harness it properly." A pause, filled with the sound of papers rustling. "Tell me, have you experienced any side effects from tonight's display? Fatigue, disorientation, memory loss?" Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The honest answer was no. He felt perfectly fine, energized even, like the ability had awakened something that had been sleeping in his cells. But admitting that felt like handing Voss ammunition. Go to hell. "I'm afraid that's not an option. You see, Marcus, you've just committed an act of domestic terrorism. 17 federal agents, incapacitated by an unknown weapon or biological agent. The Bureau is treating this as a potential WMD incident. They'll be calling in hazmat teams, CDC specialists, possibly even military containment units." Ice crystallized in Marcus's stomach. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Check the news in 30 minutes. You'll find yourself on every watch list from here to Quantico. Your face, Emma's face. Both of you designated as clear and present dangers to national security." Voss's voice carried a note of genuine satisfaction. "Of course, I could make those designations disappear. All it would take is a phone call explaining that this was simply a classified field test gone awry." Marcus saw the trap closing around them with crystalline clarity. No extraction team would risk approaching federal fugitives wanted for terrorism. No underground railroad could hide them from a nationwide manhunt. Voss had just transformed their desperate flight into an impossible situation. "What do you want?" Marcus asked again, though he already knew the answer. "Voluntary surrender. You and Emma report to the coordinates I'm about to send you. Peacefully, quietly, with no further demonstrations of your abilities. In exchange, your daughter receives a full pardon and placement in an excellent boarding school. You return to the program for completion of your psychological evaluation. Emma made a small sound, not quite a whimper, but close. Marcus reached over and squeezed her hand, feeling how cold her fingers had become. And if I refuse? Then Emma becomes an enemy combatant harbored by a domestic terrorist. You know how those stories end, Marcus. Ruby Ridge, Waco. Sometimes children get caught in crossfires during federal raids. Tragic, but unavoidable. The world went red around the edges. Marcus felt that terrible stirring in his chest again, the same force that had frozen 17 trained killers. But this time, it felt different, wilder, less controlled. The steering wheel cracked under his grip. "Dad," Emma whispered, staring at his hands. "Dad, you're scaring me." The sound of his daughter's fear cut through the rage like cold water. Marcus forced himself to breathe, to think tactically instead of emotionally. Voss was a predator, and predators always went for the throat. Emma wasn't just leverage, she was the kill shot in a game Marcus had been losing since the moment they'd found him in Cedar Falls. 30 minutes, Voss continued, his voice now carrying a hint of steel beneath the politeness. "The coordinates are being sent to your phone now. Come alone, come quietly, and Emma lives. Try to run, try to fight, and discover just how creative federal law enforcement can be when national security is at stake." The line went dead. Marcus stared at the road ahead, feeling the weight of impossible choices crushing down on his shoulders. In the distance, police sirens wailed, backup arriving for the frozen agents, or perhaps the beginning of the manhunt Voss had just unleashed. Either way, it marked the end of their options. Emma looked up at him with Sarah's eyes, trusting and afraid in equal measure. "What do we do now, Dad?" Marcus pulled into an abandoned gas station and turned off the engine. For the first time since Sarah's death, he had no answer for his daughter. Chapter 10. The Revelation. The abandoned gas station sat in a pool of broken streetlight, its shattered windows reflecting fragments of their terrified faces. Marcus stared at his hands on the steering wheel, hands that had just cracked reinforced plastic like it was kindling. The silence stretched between father and daughter, heavy with unspoken truths that could no longer be avoided. "Dad?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "What's happening to you?" Marcus looked at his 10-year-old daughter, really looked at her, and saw something that made his blood freeze. There was no shock in her eyes, no confusion, just the patient expression of someone waiting for confirmation of something she'd already figured out. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. Emma's small fingers traced patterns on her backpack, tactical diagrams, he realized now. Not random doodles, battle plans, since the playground. "When Tommy Brennan pushed me down and you got that look in your eyes." She met his gaze with Sarah's unflinching directness. "All the kids stepped back from you. Not because they were scared, because they couldn't move." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. It hadn't started at the school with Miss Rodriguez and the hallway full of frozen children. It had been building for months, maybe years. Triggered every time his daughter was threatened. Low-level exposures, too brief and subtle for adults to notice, but enough to terrify children whose instincts were still sharp. "The moving truck," Emma continued, her voice gaining confidence as she worked through the timeline. "When those men came to ask questions about our old address, you answered the door and they just left. Didn't say goodbye, didn't argue, just walked away like robots." Marcus remembered that day 3 months ago. 2 federal contractors posing as collection agents, fishing for information about David Mitchell's background. He'd felt angry, protective, but nothing more. Or so he'd thought. "And Mrs. Patterson's dog," Emma added. "When it got loose and came running at me, you stepped between us and it just stopped. Didn't even whimper. Just froze until you moved away." Each memory was another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Marcus felt his worldview reshaping itself around a terrifying new reality. The ability hadn't been dormant, it had been active all along, triggered by threats to Emma, growing stronger with each exposure. He'd been walking around Cedar Falls for 8 years as a living weapon, completely unaware of what he was becoming. The experiments, he whispered, more to himself than to Emma. What did they do to me? You don't remember? Emma's question carried a weight that seemed impossible for a 10-year-old to bear. I remember the injections, the psychological conditioning. Dr. Reeves said it was combat stress inoculation, making us immune to battlefield trauma. Marcus stared out at the empty road where their old life had just ended forever. But this is something else entirely. Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out a manila folder Marcus had never seen before. His hands shook as he opened it, finding medical charts, brain scans, and experimental protocols written in Dr. Reeves's precise handwriting. Where did you get this? Mom's safety deposit box, the one she told me about before she died. Emma's voice remained steady, but tears traced silver lines down her cheeks. She said if anything ever happened, if people came looking for you, I should bring it. She said you'd need to know the truth. Marcus scanned the documents with growing horror. Neural pathway modification, electromagnetic field manipulation, bioelectrical enhancement through targeted gene therapy. The words swam before his eyes, but their meaning was crystal clear. Project Lazarus hadn't just made him immune to combat stress, it had turned him into something that could project paralytic fields through sheer force of will. And according to the final page, Emma had inherited the same genetic markers that made him susceptible to the modifications. Dad? Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you okay? Marcus looked at his daughter, his extraordinary, tactical-minded, fearless daughter, and finally understood why Voss wanted her so badly. She wasn't just leverage, she was the next test subject. No, he said, his voice hollow with revelation. I'm not okay. I'm exactly what they designed me to be. The phone buzzed with an incoming text, coordinates and a timer counting down from 26 minutes. But Marcus no longer saw it as an ultimatum. He saw it as an invitation to field test capabilities he was only beginning to understand. Emma, he said, starting the engine. I need you to understand something. Your mother didn't die in a convoy accident. I know. Emma buckled her seatbelt with calm efficiency. She found out what they were planning to do to me. That's why she had to die. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place. Marcus pulled onto the road, no longer running toward Mrs. Chen's house or Jake's extraction team. He was driving toward the coordinates Voss had sent, but not to surrender. Ghost was going hunting. Chapter 11, Gathering Strength. The coordinates led to an abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. 3 massive warehouses surrounded by rusted chain link and overgrown parking lots. Marcus pulled the stolen Honda into the shadow of a defunct grain silo and cut the engine, his mind working through tactical possibilities with crystalline clarity. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt like he was thinking 3 steps ahead instead of merely reacting. 22 minutes, Emma said, checking the countdown timer on his phone. She'd been quiet during the drive, processing revelations that would have shattered most adults. But then, most adults hadn't been raised by a mother who died protecting state secrets and a father whose DNA had been weaponized by his own government. More than enough time. Marcus opened the manila folder again, studying the experimental protocols with new understanding. The documents painted a picture of systematic neural modification, targeted injections that had rewritten his brain's electromagnetic signature, turning him into a living EMP device calibrated specifically for human nervous systems. Emma, I need you to listen carefully. What I'm about to do is going to be dangerous. You're going in alone. It wasn't a question. Emma had already reached the same tactical conclusion he had. Marcus felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. His daughter thought like an operator because she'd been born into a war she hadn't chosen. The ability responds to emotional triggers, Marcus said, rereading Dr. Reeves's notes. Specifically, perceived threats to people I'm protecting. Voss doesn't know I understand that now. He thinks he's facing the same broken soldier who ran away 8 years ago. Emma studied the warehouse complex through the windshield. But you're not broken anymore. No. Marcus folded the documents and slipped them into his jacket pocket. I'm exactly what they designed me to be, and that's going to be their biggest mistake. He reached under the driver's seat and pulled out the emergency kit Sarah had insisted they maintain. Untraceable cash, fake identification documents, and a secure satellite phone with one number programmed into memory. Jake Morrison's emergency line. Marcus dialed and waited. "Jesus Christ, Ghost, where are you?" Jake's voice crackled through encryption static. "The entire federal apparatus is looking for you. FBI, ATF, even Homeland Security. Whatever you did in that alley. I need an extraction for my daughter. Clean papers, safe house, complete disappearance." Marcus watched Emma's reflection in the passenger window, memorizing every detail of her young face. 15 minutes, at the coordinates I'm sending you. What about you? "I'm ending this." Marcus typed the grain silo's GPS location into the phone. "Emma has documents that prove everything. The experiments, the conspiracy, Sarah's murder. Get them to someone who can expose Lazarus properly. Ghost, don't do anything stupid. We can figure this out." "No." Marcus's voice carried absolute finality. "Voss made one critical error. He threatened my daughter on American soil. That makes this a domestic operation, which means limited backup, skeleton crew, minimal oversight. He's vulnerable." Emma turned from the window, her dark eyes bright with understanding. "You're not surrendering. You're attacking." "Smart girl." Marcus ended the call and checked his weapon. 17 rounds remaining in the Sig Sauer, plus 2 spare magazines. Enough for a small war, assuming conventional tactics worked against whatever Voss had waiting. "But I need you to promise me something. When Jake arrives, you go with him. No arguments, no heroics. Just disappear. What if you don't come back?" The question hung between them like a physical weight. Marcus reached across the seat and pulled Emma into a fierce hug, breathing in the scent of her hair and committing it to permanent memory. "Then you live," he whispered against the top of her head. "You grow up strong and smart and free. You become everything your mother dreamed you could be. And you never ever let them turn you into what they made me." Emma's small arms tightened around his neck. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, kiddo. More than you'll ever know." Marcus released her and stepped out of the car, feeling something fundamental shift inside his chest. The rage was still there, cold, controlled, absolutely lethal, but underneath it, something else had awakened. Purpose, direction. For 8 years he'd been running from the monster they'd created. Now he was going to show them exactly how effective their weapon could be when properly motivated. The warehouse complex loomed ahead, dark windows reflecting starlight like dead eyes. Somewhere inside, Colonel Voss waited with his skeleton crew of contractors and federal assets, confident that Marcus Brennan would walk through those doors as a broken man seeking to protect his daughter. Instead, they were about to meet Ghost, the most successful product of Project Lazarus, operating at full capacity for the first time in his manufactured life. Marcus checked his watch. 18 minutes remaining. Time to go to work. Chapter 12, The Road Back. The first perimeter guard never saw him coming. Marcus moved through the industrial complex like smoke given form, every lesson from 15 years of special operations flooding back with crystalline clarity. The experimental modifications hadn't just rewired his brain, they'd enhanced his natural abilities, turning him into something that existed in the spaces between human perception and nightmare. The guard was checking his phone when Marcus materialized from the shadows behind a shipping container. No words, no warnings. Just a hand on the shoulder and that familiar stirring in Marcus's chest. The man's body went rigid, eyes wide with terror, frozen mid-scroll through whatever social media had been occupying his attention. "Sweet dreams," Marcus whispered, relieving the guard of his radio, sidearm, and tactical vest. The man would stay conscious but paralyzed for approximately 20 minutes, more than enough time for what came next. 16 minutes remaining. The warehouse complex sprawled before him like a concrete maze, 3 massive buildings connected by covered walkways and service tunnels. Voss had chosen the location well, isolated, defensible, with multiple escape routes and clear sight lines. But he'd also made the mistake of underestimating his target. The colonel remembered Marcus Brennan, the broken soldier who'd fled Project Lazarus 8 years ago. He had no frame of reference for Ghost, the weapon that love and desperation had finally awakened. Marcus pressed against the outer wall of the first warehouse, listening to radio chatter through the stolen earpiece. 6 voices, maybe 7, all contractors from the sound of their tactical jargon, professional but not military, corporate soldiers who'd learned their skills in boardrooms rather than battlefields. They were coordinating a perimeter sweep, confident that their quarry would approach the main entrance like a good little asset reporting for psychological evaluation. Instead, Marcus scaled the loading dock service ladder and slipped through a ventilation grate that would have been impossible for anyone larger than his lean frame. The warehouse's interior stretched below him, rows of abandoned machinery creating perfect cover, while overhead catwalks provided elevated firing positions. Voss had turned the space into a kill box, assuming Marcus would enter at ground level. Another tactical miscalculation. Marcus dropped silently onto a conveyor belt, rolled behind a defunct packaging machine, and immediately spotted 3 heat signatures through the stolen night vision goggles. 2 contractors flanking the main entrance, 1 sniper positioned on the opposite catwalk with a clear shot at the door. Textbook formation for capturing a single target approaching from outside. Time to rewrite the textbook. The sniper felt it first, that inexplicable sensation of wrongness that preceded Marcus's ability by several seconds. He started to turn, started to radio a warning, but then Marcus stepped into his line of sight, and the man's nervous system simply shut down. The rifle clattered against the catwalk's metal grating, the sound echoing through the warehouse like a death knell. Overwatch, report, crackled through the radio. "Thompson, what was that noise?" Marcus keyed the stolen transmitter and spoke in the sniper's voice, a skill that had served him well during infiltration missions in Afghanistan. "Drop my water bottle. All clear up here. Roger that. Target still 15 minutes out. Stay sharp." 14 minutes, actually, but Marcus saw no reason to correct them. The 2 guards at the entrance died as quietly as their perimeter colleague, one paralyzed while checking his weapon, the other frozen mid-stride during a routine patrol. Marcus felt the ability responding to his emotional state with increasing precision, no longer the wild, uncontrolled force that had terrorized the elementary school. This was surgical, targeted, absolutely lethal in its efficiency. He was becoming everything the Project Lazarus scientists had dreamed of creating. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, Marcus felt only cold satisfaction as he moved deeper into the complex. These men had threatened Emma. They'd killed Sarah. They'd spent 8 years hunting his family like animals, and now they were about to discover that sometimes the prey evolved into something far more dangerous than its predators. The second warehouse contained the real surprise: banks of computer equipment, medical monitoring stations, and what looked like a fully equipped surgical suite. This wasn't just a meeting point, it was a mobile laboratory, designed to continue the experiments that had created him. Marcus studied the setup through infrared imaging, counting heat signatures and mapping patrol routes. Colonel Voss waited in a glass-walled office overlooking the medical equipment, flanked by 2 more contractors. On the main floor, technicians in lab coats prepared syringes and calibrated electromagnetic field detectors, obviously expecting to study their subjects' abilities in real time. They wanted to see what Ghost could do? Marcus checked his watch. 11 minutes remaining. Time to give them a demonstration they'd never forget. He keyed the radio one final time, speaking in his own voice for the first time since entering the complex. "Colonel Voss," he said quietly. "Ghost is in the house." The complex exploded into panicked chatter, but Marcus was already moving, flowing through shadows like death itself had learned to walk upright. The final confrontation had begun. The medical technicians were the first to understand their mistake. Marcus dropped through a ceiling vent into the main laboratory, landing in a crouch between 2 monitoring stations as alarms began wailing throughout the complex. The white-coated figures spun toward him in perfect synchronization, syringes and electromagnetic detectors scattering across polished floors as their nervous systems encountered something their equipment could never measure: pure, weaponized terror. The paralysis field expanded outward like ripples in dark water. 7 technicians froze mid-scream, their faces locked in expressions of primal horror as Marcus rose from his combat stance. This wasn't the uncontrolled burst that had devastated the elementary school. This was precision incarnate, his ability responding to years of tactical training and 8 years of suppressed rage. Fascinating, Colonel Voss's voice echoed from the glass office above. Readings indicate a focused electromagnetic pulse operating on neural frequencies we've never recorded. You've exceeded every projection, Marcus. You've become magnificent. Marcus looked up through the laboratory's observation windows, studying the man who'd orchestrated his family's destruction. Voss stood behind reinforced glass, flanked by his remaining contractors, watching the paralyzed technicians with scientific fascination rather than human concern. The colonel had aged in 8 years, more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes, but his expression remained unchanged, cold, calculating, utterly convinced of his own righteousness. "Where is she?" Marcus's voice carried absolute authority as he moved between the frozen figures, checking their equipment with professional interest. Electromagnetic field generators, neural activity monitors, industrial-grade restraint systems. They'd planned to strap him down and study him like a laboratory animal. "Where's my daughter?" "Safe," Voss replied, pressing a button that activated speakers throughout the laboratory. "For now. Though I confess, Marcus, this demonstration raises interesting questions about Emma's potential. Our genetic analysis suggests she carries the same modified DNA sequences that made you so receptive to our enhancements." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, confirming his worst fears about the manila folder's contents. Emma wasn't just leverage. She was the next phase of Project Lazarus, a second-generation test subject born with modifications that had required surgical implantation in her father. Marcus felt the rage building in his chest, felt his ability responding to the emotional surge. Around him, electronic equipment began sparking as his bioelectrical field expanded beyond human targets. Computer screens flickered and died. Monitoring equipment crashed with cascades of error messages. The laboratory's fluorescent lights strobed like a nightclub before exploding in showers of glass and sparks. "Remarkable," Voss breathed, his voice thick with scientific wonder. "You're not just affecting neural pathways anymore. You're generating a broad-spectrum EMP field. The applications for modern warfare are—" "Shut up!" Marcus's voice cut through the observation chamber like a blade, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across Voss's features. "I'm done being your science project. I'm done running, and I'm especially done listening to you talk about my daughter like she's your next experiment." Marcus began walking toward the glass office, his electromagnetic field intensifying with each step. The paralyzed technicians remained frozen in place, but their equipment continued dying around them, million-dollar medical devices reduced to smoking junk by the walking EMP weapon they'd helped create. The 2 contractors flanking Voss raised their weapons, military-grade rifles loaded with tranquilizer rounds designed for large game capture. They'd done their homework, Marcus realized. Standard ammunition wouldn't stop someone in his condition, but enough chemical sedatives could shut down even a modified nervous system. If they got the chance to fire— Marcus stepped into the contractor's sight lines and felt his ability focus like a laser. Both men went rigid instantly, their fingers frozen on triggers that would never fire. Behind them, Voss pressed himself against the office's rear wall, his scientific fascination finally giving way to something approaching human fear. "This isn't possible," the colonel whispered, staring at his paralyzed guards. "The conditioning protocols should prevent you from harming federal personnel. The psychological blocks were designed to control Marcus Brennan," Ghost replied, placing his palm against the reinforced glass. Hairline cracks appeared around his hand, spreading outward like a spiderweb as his electromagnetic field interfaced directly with the office's security systems. "But Marcus died the day you killed his wife. What's left is everything you made me to be." The glass shattered. Marcus stepped through the jagged opening, moving with unhurried precision toward the man who'd destroyed his family. Behind him, the laboratory continued dying in cascades of sparks and smoke. Ahead, Voss fumbled for a sidearm with hands that shook like autumn leaves. But Marcus felt no satisfaction in the colonel's terror, only cold purpose, and the absolute certainty that everything he'd learned, every tactical skill, every enhancement, every moment of rage and loss and love, had led to this single moment of reckoning. The final test had begun. Voss's weapon never cleared its holster. Marcus crossed the glass-littered floor in 2 strides, his hand closing around the colonel's wrist with mechanical precision. Bones ground together as Voss's nervous system seized, the paralysis field washing over him like a tide of absolute terror. The pistol clattered to the floor, forgotten, as 8 years of suppressed fury finally found its target. 8 years, Marcus whispered, lifting Voss by the throat until the older man's feet left the ground. 8 years of running. 8 years of watching my daughter grow up in hiding because you couldn't accept that your precious experiment wanted out. Voss's eyes bulged with more than oxygen deprivation. The paralysis field operated on frequencies that bypassed conscious thought, triggering primal fear responses buried deep in the reptilian brain. Every survival instinct the colonel possessed screamed that death stood inches away, wearing the face of humanity's apex predator. "You can't," Voss gasped through frozen vocal cords. "Federal asset killing me, brakes, conditioning." Marcus smiled, and there was nothing human in the expression. "I told you, Colonel. Marcus Brennan is dead, and Ghost was never your asset. Ghost is what happens when you torture a good man past his breaking point and give him the tools to fight back." The office windows exploded outward as Marcus's electromagnetic field reached critical intensity. Computers throughout the complex died in electronic screams. Emergency lighting failed, plunging the warehouse into darkness broken only by sparks and the crimson glow of fire suppression systems triggering throughout the facility. But Marcus could see perfectly. His enhanced nervous system processed electromagnetic radiation across spectrums, invisible to baseline humans, turning the darkness into a tactical advantage. He watched Voss's face cycle through terror, rage, and finally something approaching understanding. "Sarah," the colonel wheezed. "You're doing this for Sarah." Wrong thing to say. Marcus slammed Voss against the office wall hard enough to crack reinforced concrete. "Don't you dare speak her name. Don't you dare pretend this was anything but murder. She discovered what you did to me, what you planned to do to Emma, and you had her killed to protect your precious project. She was going to expose everything." Voss's words came in broken gasps as Marcus's grip tightened. 30 years of research, billions in development. Couldn't let one woman. The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow. For 8 years, he'd suspected the truth but never had confirmation. Now Voss had confessed to Sarah's murder with the casual indifference of a man discussing weather patterns. As if the woman Marcus loved, Emma's mother, had been nothing more than an inconvenient variable in a complex equation. Marcus felt something fundamental break inside his chest. Not his heart, which had shattered years ago, but the last restraints holding his modifications in check. The psychological conditioning that had limited his abilities to defensive applications crumbled like sand castles before a hurricane. Every safeguard the military psychiatrists had installed dissolved in a flood of pure concentrated hatred. The paralysis field exploded outward with the force of a small nuclear weapon. Every piece of electronic equipment in a 3-block radius died instantly. Car alarms shrieked and fell silent. Streetlights flickered out. Emergency generators failed as electromagnetic pulses fried their control circuits. In the warehouse complex, frozen contractors collapsed as their nervous systems overloaded. Unconscious, but alive, Marcus held Voss suspended in the heart of the storm, watching the colonel's face as understanding finally dawned. "You're not just enhanced," Voss whispered, his voice filled with scientific wonder even as terror consumed his features. "You've evolved. The modifications have been adapting, growing stronger each time you use them. You're not the end result of Project Lazarus. You're the beginning." "Wrong again," Marcus replied, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through steel and concrete. "I'm the end of your experiments, the end of your project, the end of everyone who thinks they can use human beings as raw material for their weapons programs." He leaned closer, until Voss could see his reflection in Marcus's dark eyes. "But first, you're going to tell me where my daughter is. And Colonel, for your sake, you better hope she's unharmed." Voss's mouth opened to respond, but the words never came. His eyes widened with sudden panic, focusing on something behind Marcus's shoulder. A red laser dot appeared on the office wall, dancing across the smoke-filled air before settling on Marcus's back. "Sniper," Voss croaked through his paralyzed throat. "Always have backup." Marcus smiled again, that predatory expression that belonged to nightmares rather than human faces. He didn't turn around, didn't even acknowledge the threat, because Ghost had been designed to be the perfect weapon, and perfect weapons didn't die to anything as simple as a bullet. The shot rang out across the burning warehouse complex, and Marcus Brennan finally discovered what it truly meant to be magnificent. The bullet struck Marcus between the shoulder blades with enough force to stagger a normal man. The high-velocity round, designed to penetrate military-grade body armor, should have dropped him instantly. Instead, it struck something that defied physics, an electromagnetic barrier that caught the projectile like a spider's web catching a fly. The bullet hung suspended in the air for a heartbeat, its copper jacket glowing red-hot as Marcus's bioelectrical field interfaced with the metal. Then, it simply stopped existing. Atomic bonds dissolved as electromagnetic forces tore the round apart at a molecular level, reducing military-grade ammunition to harmless dust. Marcus didn't even flinch. "Impossible," Voss breathed, his scientific mind struggling to process what he'd witnessed. The modifications weren't designed for that level of matter manipulation. "You're operating beyond any theoretical framework Theory," Marcus interrupted, finally turning to face the sniper's nest across the warehouse complex, "meets practice." Through the shattered windows, he could see the shooter, another contractor, positioned on the catwalk, where Thompson's body still lay frozen. The man's face was white with terror as he worked the bolt action, chambering another round with hands that shook like earthquake victims. Professional training warred with primal fear as he struggled to process the impossibility of what he'd just witnessed. Marcus extended his hand toward the distant figure, and the sniper rifle simply came apart. Screws backed themselves out. Metal components separated along stress fractures. The weapon disassembled itself piece by piece until nothing remained but scattered components raining down onto the warehouse floor 60 feet below. The contractor followed moments later, his paralyzed form toppling from the catwalk as his nervous system overloaded. "Magnificent," Voss whispered again. And Marcus realized the colonel was no longer speaking from fear, but from pure scientific ecstasy. Even facing death, Voss couldn't stop marveling at his creation. The applications are limitless. Imagine entire enemy installations shut down by a single operative. Imagine this, Marcus said, turning back to face his tormentor. "Your daughter, taken from everything she knows. Your wife, murdered for trying to protect her family. Your life, 8 years of running and hiding and watching shadows because monsters in expensive suits decided you were property instead of human." He lifted Voss higher until the colonel's feet dangled inches above broken glass. "Now imagine that the weapon you created to serve your ambitions has only one target left." But even as Marcus spoke the words, even as righteous fury demanded Voss's death, something else stirred in the depths of his enhanced consciousness. A small voice that sounded remarkably like Emma, asking the question that had driven him across 3 states and through 8 years of hell, what would Mom want? Sarah had died trying to expose Project Lazarus, trying to protect Emma from becoming the next generation of human weapons. She'd sacrificed everything to give their daughter a chance at a normal life. And now Marcus stood on the precipice of becoming exactly what the project had designed him to be, a killer without conscience, a weapon that served its own appetite for vengeance. If he killed Voss, he would win this battle but lose the war for his own soul. But if he didn't? Through the electromagnetic chaos surrounding the warehouse, Marcus felt something that made his blood freeze. Another presence. Young, terrified, familiar in a way that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at every parental instinct he possessed. Emma. She was here. Somewhere in the complex, his 10-year-old daughter waited in a cell or laboratory, probably watching everything through security monitors, seeing her father transform into the monster that nightmares were made of. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice. He could kill Voss, complete his revenge, and damn himself forever in Emma's eyes. Or he could show mercy, preserve what remained of his humanity, and risk everything on the hope that love was stronger than the weapons they'd built into his DNA. When he opened his eyes again, his decision was made. "You're right about one thing, Colonel," Marcus said quietly, lowering Voss until the man's feet touched the floor but maintaining his crushing grip. "The modifications have evolved, but not in the way you think." He leaned close, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "They've made me capable of mercy. And that terrifies you more than any weapon ever could, because mercy requires choice, and choice means I'm still human enough to surprise you." Marcus released Voss's throat but kept the paralysis field active, holding the colonel frozen in place. "You're going to take me to Emma. Now. And, Colonel, if she's been harmed in any way, if she's been touched by your scientists or drugged or frightened any more than absolutely necessary, then I'll show you exactly what this magnificent weapon is truly capable of." The look in Marcus's eyes promised that death would be the kindest option available. And somewhere in the burning complex, Emma waited for her father to choose between the monster and the man. Voss stumbled forward on unsteady legs as Marcus released the paralysis field, leaving the colonel's nervous system to recover from the electromagnetic assault. Around them, the warehouse complex continued burning. Emergency sprinklers had triggered throughout the facility, but most of the suppression systems had died along with everything else electronic when Marcus's ability reached critical mass. "Sub-basement 3, Voss gasped, one hand pressed against his throat where Marcus's fingers had left bruises. "Secure holding. She's unharmed, sedated for transport but unharmed." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest at the word sedated, but he pushed down the surge of protective rage. Emma needed him functional, not consumed by fury. "Lead the way, Colonel. And remember, I can feel lies now. Something about enhanced neural sensitivity." It wasn't entirely true, but Voss didn't need to know that. The psychological warfare that had sustained Marcus through 8 years of Special Forces operations served him well against the man who'd destroyed his family. They moved through corridors filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning electronics. Emergency lighting flickered sporadically. The few circuits that had survived Marcus's electromagnetic pulse struggled to maintain power. Frozen contractors lay scattered throughout the complex like fallen statues, their faces locked in expressions of primal terror. "They'll recover," Marcus said, noticing Voss's concerned glances at his people. "Unconscious for a few hours. Maybe some temporary neural disruption, but alive." "More mercy than you showed my wife." Voss flinched at the words but kept walking. Sarah was never supposed to die. The original plan was extraction and memory modification, clean, surgical, no permanent harm. But she fought back, and the contractors panicked. "Stop." Marcus's voice carried enough electromagnetic resonance to rattle the walls. "Every word you speak about her is a reason to reconsider my decision to let you live." They descended through service corridors and emergency stairwells, moving deeper into the warehouse complex's hidden infrastructure. With each level, the facility became more obviously military: reinforced blast doors, biometric scanners dead in their frames, corridors wide enough for equipment transport. This wasn't some hastily converted warehouse space. This was a purpose-built black site, constructed specifically for Project Lazarus operations. How many other enhanced individuals had been brought here? How many families destroyed in the name of national security and scientific progress? Sub-basement 3 required a keycard that Voss produced from his jacket pocket, along with a numeric code entered on a manual backup system, one of the few security measures that could function without electronic support. The heavy door cycled open with pneumatic hisses, revealing a corridor lined with reinforced cells. Most stood empty, but soft light emanated from the third door on the left. Marcus moved past Voss without a word. his enhanced senses already confirming what his heart had known since entering the complex. Emma's scent, her breathing pattern, the unique bioelectrical signature that every parent learned to recognize in their child. She was here, alive, and his entire world narrowed to the space between himself and that single door. The cell contained a hospital bed, monitoring equipment, and a small figure that looked impossibly fragile under white medical blankets. Emma lay unconscious, and four-line in her arm delivering whatever sedatives they'd used to keep her compliant during transport. Her face was peaceful in sleep, but Marcus could see the tear tracks on her cheeks, evidence that she'd been awake and terrified before the drugs took hold. "The sedation is purely precautionary," Voss said quietly from the doorway. "Midazolam, standard dosage for her weight and age. She'll wake naturally in 2 to 3 hours with no lasting effects." Marcus knelt beside the bed, his enhanced senses confirming the colonel's words. Emma's vital signs were strong and stable, her breathing deep and regular. Whatever else they'd done, they hadn't hurt her physically. The knowledge should have provided comfort, but Marcus understood that some wounds couldn't be detected by medical monitors. "She watched the school surveillance footage," he said, without looking up from Emma's sleeping face. "When your people took her, she saw me freeze an entire hallway full of children and teachers. Yes, she knows what I am now. What you made me." Voss stepped carefully into the cell, maintaining distance but moving closer. "Perhaps that's not entirely unfortunate. Emma carries the same genetic modifications that made you so receptive to enhancement. With proper training and guidance, she could—" Marcus's head turned with predatory precision, and Voss's words died in his throat. The look in Ghost's eyes promised consequences beyond imagination. "That thought," Marcus said with deadly quiet, "ends here. Emma will never be part of your project. She'll never be enhanced or modified or turned into a weapon. She's going to have the normal childhood that you stole from both of us." "And how exactly do you propose to accomplish that?" Voss asked. "You've just demonstrated abilities that violate known physics. Every intelligence agency in the world will be hunting you within hours. Where can you possibly hide that we won't eventually find you?" Marcus stood slowly, his decision crystallizing with absolute clarity. "We're not hiding anymore, Colonel. We're going home." The electromagnetic pulse that had crippled the warehouse complex extended far beyond what Marcus had initially realized. As they emerged from the underground facility carrying Emma's still unconscious form, he discovered that his evolved abilities had created a dead zone stretching across several city blocks. Traffic lights hung dark and useless. Cars sat abandoned in intersections, their electronic systems fried beyond repair. Emergency services struggled to respond with equipment that functioned purely on mechanical principles. Marcus had done this. The magnitude of destruction, unintentional but undeniable, served as a stark reminder of what he'd become. Emma stirred in his arms as they reached the warehouse parking lot, her eyelids fluttering as the sedatives began to wear off. When she finally opened her eyes and saw his face, Marcus braced himself for fear, for the same terror he'd seen in every other person who'd witnessed his abilities. Instead, Emma whispered, "Daddy, are you okay? You look hurt." The simple question nearly broke him. After everything she'd witnessed, everything she'd endured, her first concern was for his well-being. Marcus held her closer, feeling something fundamental shift in his chest, not the modifications or the electromagnetic field, but something purely human. "I'm fine, sweetheart. We're going home. Are the bad men going to follow us?" Marcus looked back at Voss, who stood beside a convoy of disabled vehicles, surveying the destruction with the detached fascination of a scientist observing an unexpected experimental result. The colonel's remaining contractors were beginning to regain consciousness, but their equipment remained dead. It would be hours before they could mount any kind of pursuit. "No," Marcus said with quiet certainty. "They're not." The drive back to Cedar Falls took 18 hours in a borrowed truck, one of the few vehicles in the area old enough to function without computerized engine management. Emma slept for most of the journey, curled against Marcus's side as he drove through the night. When she was awake, they talked carefully around the edges of what had happened, both of them learning to navigate this new reality where her father possessed abilities that defied explanation. The kids at school saw it on the news. Emma said as they crossed the Oregon state line. About the warehouse burning down and all the power going out. They're saying it was some kind of terrorist attack. And what do you think it was? Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the forest rushing past their windows. I think my dad loves me enough to fight monsters, even if it means becoming scary himself. The words hit Marcus harder than any bullet could have. His daughter understood, with the clarity that only children possessed, exactly what had transpired. She'd seen him freeze a school hallway, watched him destroy a military facility, and somehow still recognized the man who'd raised her for 10 years. Cedar Falls looked exactly the same as when they'd left, if you didn't count the FBI surveillance vehicles parked discreetly throughout the town. Marcus spotted at least 6 different agencies as they drove down Main Street, all trying to maintain covers that fooled no one. The federal response had been swift and predictable. Their house was surrounded by crime scene tape, the front yard torn up by evidence collection teams, but Marcus had expected that. He pulled into the driveway of their neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who emerged from her front door before they'd even stopped the truck. Marcus, Emma. She rushed toward them with tears streaming down her face. When they said you'd been kidnapped, when the FBI started asking questions, we thought we'd never see you again. The reunion that followed felt like stepping back into a previous life. Mrs. Chen had organized the entire neighborhood into search parties before the FBI arrived and took over the investigation. Emma's teacher, Miss Rodriguez, had driven over from her apartment to wait with the other neighbors. Even Principal Davidson was there, his usual administrative composure replaced by genuine concern. But Marcus could see the difference in how they looked at him now. The school surveillance footage had leaked. Someone always leaked sensitive material in small towns, and while they tried to hide it, he caught the subtle signs of unease. The way conversations paused when he entered a room, the careful distance people maintained, as if he might accidentally freeze them all. He was the same man who'd lived among them for 8 years, but he was also something else now, something unprecedented and potentially dangerous. Emma seemed to sense the tension during their temporary stay at Mrs. Chen's house. That evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the sun set over the Cascade Mountains, she asked the question he'd been dreading. Are we going to have to leave again, Daddy? Because of what you can do? Marcus looked down at his daughter, this remarkable child who'd seen impossible things and somehow maintained faith in the father who'd failed to protect her from them. He thought about Voss's warning that every intelligence agency in the world would be hunting them. He thought about the federal agents currently cataloging every aspect of their former life. Then he thought about Emma's words in the truck, I think my dad loves me enough to fight monsters. No, sweetheart, Marcus said, his decision crystallizing with absolute certainty. We're not running anymore. This is our home. These are our people. And if anyone wants to change that, they'll have to go through me first. When Emma smiled and leaned against his side, Marcus finally understood what Colonel Voss had failed to recognize about his magnificent weapon. Love had indeed made him more powerful than any military enhancement, but it had also made him more human than ever before. The new beginning. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the doorway of his rebuilt workshop, watching Emma practice her presentation for the school science fair. She'd chosen volcanoes as her topic, a safe, conventional subject that made him smile. After everything they'd been through, his daughter was determinedly normal. Mount St. Helens erupted because of pressure building up over time, she explained to her cardboard volcano, adjusting her safety goggles with scientific precision. But the explosion wasn't the end of the story. It was actually a new beginning. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. Their house had been returned to them after 6 weeks of federal investigation, though Marcus suspected the delay had more to do with bureaucratic confusion than evidence collection. How do you classify a man who can generate electromagnetic pulses through pure emotion? What agency has jurisdiction over abilities that shouldn't exist? In the end, they'd simply given up trying to categorize him. The workshop bore little resemblance to its former incarnation. Marcus had rebuilt everything from scratch, but this time he'd added modifications that only someone with his enhanced understanding of electrical systems could achieve. Backup generators with hardened circuits, surveillance equipment that could function even if his abilities triggered accidentally, emergency protocols for the safety of anyone who visited. He'd learned to live with what he'd become, but he refused to endanger others through carelessness. "Dad?" Emma called from her workstation. "Mrs. Patterson is here for her bike." Marcus looked up to see their elderly neighbor approaching the workshop entrance, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who wasn't quite sure what to expect. 3 months ago, Helen Patterson would have wandered directly into his workspace, chatting about her grandchildren while he worked. Now she paused at the threshold, waiting for permission. "Come on in, Helen. Just finished with the tune-up." She entered slowly, her eyes darting around the space as if expecting something extraordinary to happen. When nothing did, when Marcus simply handed her the keys and explained the work he'd performed, some of the tension left her shoulders. "You know," she said, counting out bills from her purse, "people in town were worried at first. After what happened at the school, after those news reports, well, you understand." Marcus nodded. He did understand. Fear was a natural response to the inexplicable. "But then we started thinking about who you've always been. 8 years of birthday parties and Little League games and helping fix Mrs. Chen's fence every spring. 8 years of being our neighbor, our friend." Helen paused, meeting his eyes directly. "Whatever else you might be, Marcus, you're still that man. And that man has never been anything but good to this community." After she left, Emma looked up from her volcano with a thoughtful expression. "She's not scared of you anymore." "No, I don't think she is. Are you still scared of yourself?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. Emma had developed an uncomfortable talent for cutting straight to the heart of complex issues. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but less than I used to be." It was true. The nightmares had faded gradually as Marcus learned to control his abilities through meditation and careful practice. He'd discovered that the electromagnetic field responded to intention rather than emotion, a crucial distinction that made accidental activation far less likely. The frozen hallway at Pinewood Elementary had been born from desperate panic. With focus and understanding, he could modulate the effect or suppress it entirely. Dr. Sarah Kim, the trauma counselor the school district had provided, helped both him and Emma process what they'd experienced. Weekly sessions that gradually revealed how resilience could grow from the worst circumstances, how families could heal even from extraordinary wounds. "Principal Davidson called earlier," Marcus said, returning to his workbench. "He wants to discuss your transition back to regular classes." Emma had been homeschooled since their return, partly due to media attention, but mostly because she'd needed time to readjust. The bullying that had precipitated everything seemed almost trivial now, but Marcus understood that trauma didn't respect proportionality. "I think I'm ready," Emma said quietly. "Miss Rodriguez says Tyler and his friends have been asking about me. I think they want to apologize. How do you feel about that? Like maybe everyone deserves a chance to start over." That evening, Marcus sat on their front porch as sunset painted the Cascade Mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Federal surveillance had ended 2 weeks ago, officially at least, and Cedar Falls felt like home again rather than a temporary refuge. Emma emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate, settling beside him on the porch swing they'd rebuilt together. "Dad, do you think Mom would be proud of us?" Marcus considered the question carefully. Sarah had died protecting their family from Project Lazarus, sacrificing everything to give Emma a chance at normal life. Now her daughter was preparing for 5th grade, worrying about science fair presentations and making friends. Now her husband had chosen humanity over vengeance, love over the weapon he'd been designed to become. "I think," Marcus said, wrapping his arm around Emma's shoulders, "she'd say we finally made it home." Above them, the first stars began appearing in the darkening sky, and Marcus Ghost Brennan felt peace settle in his chest, like a long-held breath finally released.